If you like the video, then please consider supporting Slopes Game Room on Patreon. There are plenty of video games set in the future. It almost goes as far back as gaming itself. Now for me, it doesn't get any better than Wipeout 2097. I spent an absurd amount of time with this game, as did plenty of my friends with Extreme G. But those N64 gamers also had another futuristic racer up their sleeves that constantly tackled my prodigy blasting grey beast, and that was of course F-Zero X. Which, would you believe it, was my first introduction to this brilliant series. F-Zero is absolutely legendary, a game series that makes the world, including myself, constantly ask the same question every single time a new Nintendo machine is released. When's a new F-Zero game coming out? When's a new F-Zero game coming out? When's a new F-Zero game coming out? Nintendo answered our prayers with Metroid Prime and sort of did with the 2D games too. And now Nintendo, you gotta do it again. Make this complete history defunct with a nice Nintendo Switch announcement. But until that day when it inevitably doesn't happen, you can join me as we take a look at the complete history of the F-Zero franchise, where we'll be looking at the game's development, its rejected beginnings, its surprising mascot, and of course, the games. Welcome to Slopes Game Room. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna start a heavily Nintendo themed video by saying that the best F-Zero game was made by SEGA. Oh, come on. It's me, of course I'm gonna say that. Feel free to let me know how wrong I am in the comments. The reason I say this is that this was the days of the incredible GameCube, probably one of my favourite Nintendo systems ever made. And I'll admit, although it is my favourite in this series, it would be nothing without what came before it. And with that, well, I think we're in fact getting a little ahead of ourselves. So, let's go back to the beginning. The Nintendo Entertainment System, aka, get ready for it, the NES. Yep. This bad boy was rather popular, don't you know, and was easily the surefire winner for the majority of the gaming world outside of Europe and Brazil, that is. Now, unlike Sega's perfect example of not being able to sit still during the 16-bit generation with failed add-on after failed add-on, the Nintendo generation before this was quite the opposite. You see, during that 8-bit era, the mighty N was doing so bloody well with this ugly grey brick and its far sexier red and cream design that they didn't really see much of a point in upgrading it. In fact, they was advised against this exact thing after the struggling mess that was the disk system by the big wigs up top. If it's not broke, then why bother fixing it, right? Well, I suppose looking back this might seem a little stupid. I mean, what was Nintendo gonna do in all honesty? Just stay in the 8-bit generation forever? Obviously not. They would have had to eventually upgrade, but like I said, during the mid to late 80s, they simply thought, why bother? I mean, come on, even in the Genesis early days, before the release of that blue single-eyed alien looking thing, Nintendo was still ahead of the game in North America. But in Japan, it had become quite the different story. Not because of Sega, but instead it was that other company, NEC. Yep, the PC Engine had already come out and it had done what nobody had predicted or thought was possible. it actually started to take a lead and even beat Nintendo in sales. Now, obviously, like I said, this wasn't the case in the States, and again, like I said, Nintendo's 8-bit wonder was actually beating Sega's 16-bit wonder, as well as NEC's American offering of the PC Engine, the TurboGrafx 16. But the big question was, how long was that gonna honestly last when the mighty Blue was pumping out advertisements like this? Ooh, Nintendo, it's time to buck up your ideas, sunshine, and get to work on your almighty 16-bit rival. Now, this all may just sound like I'm poking fun at Nintendo. After all, it is pretty common knowledge that I, DJ Slope, that 34-year-old nerd with too many trips to Sega under his belt, still lives in the fantasy zone land of the mid-90s, where talks of the Mega Drive versus Super Nintendo ruled the playground. But come on, let's get real here. Even though the Mega Drive is still my favourite system of all time, and although it did beat Nintendo to the market by 2 whole years, even I can admit that coming out second most definitely has its advantages. Technology was rapidly moving along in the late 80s, and by the year 1990, the year that this bad boy was released, they most definitely had played the fashionably late card. This curvy upgrade could pump out more colours than Sega's offering, it had arguably the best controller of that generation, and it had far more advanced sound capabilities too. Although Sega did have its rivals in that department, didn't it? But with all of that, it still had one sneaky trick up its sleeve, and that was of course Mode 7. Ah, yes, Mode 7. The Mega Drive had blast processing, whatever that is, and the Super Nintendo had Mode 7. Whatever that is. Of course you know what Mode 7 is. I think I may be the only channel on YouTube that hasn't talked about it up to this date. Well, just in case this is the first video you ever played on the big red button, allow me to break my Mode 7 cherry and explain. This is a Super Nintendo game. Just like the competition and what came before it, it's rather simple. You got your main sprites that you control, the world around them that you interact with, enemies, obstacles, backgrounds, all the usual traits. Besides certain games looking better than others, not a hell of a lot of differences have really occurred since David Crane's Pitfall and Nintendo's later Mario releases. Technically I mean. But keeping an eye on the background for a minute, besides improving the layers, aka the parallax scrolling, the Super Nintendo had this Mode 7 thing, which, as you may have guessed, was the 7th mode available to developers that differentiated the system from other platforms. To put it simply, this 7th mode allowed the dev team to be able to rotate and scale the pixelated background on a scanline by scanline basis in an attempt to make a sort of fake 3D effect. Did it actually work though? Of course it bloody did! It's what you constantly hear about from SNES fans, and, well, fair play. For a 16-bit system, it really did help push this system away from the competition, and it was something that was constantly raved about in Nintendo publications such as the infamous Nintendo Power magazine. So, with this sexy new feature inside its sexy new system, whilst companies like Sega were slowly chipping away at the Big Red's bottom line with rather obscure but obviously brilliant licenses, Nintendo needed a game that would show all of those die-hard Nintendo fans that were still waiting to upgrade what this new exotic system could actually do.
抜きつ抜かれつのデッドヒート、走りながら順位がわかるファミコングランプリ F1 レース。ベストタイムをディスクファックスするとスーパーマリオのゲームウォッチが当たる。ブレーキ遅い。夢が遅れるディスクシステム。
The inspiration for the game that we're talking about today actually came from the previously released Japan exclusive game Famicom Grand Prix F1 Race. If you think it looks basic, well, you wouldn't be alone, as Nintendo of America thought so too. Apparently it just wasn't cool enough, hence why it stayed in Japan. The game was created by HAL Labs, most well known for the Kirby, Mother and Smash Brother games. Famicom Grand Prix F1 Race, which we'll now call Fukpa for 1R, was headed by Kazenobu Shimizu, and the rejection of this new creation lit a bit of a bonfire underneath him to go back to Japan and try again. But before our wounded Shimizu-san went home with Fukpa for 1R still in hand, whilst he was in the States, he decided to go to the cinema to perk himself up. Tim Burton's Batman movie was doing the rounds at the time, and Shimizu-san liked what he saw. Nintendo of America wanted cool, and come on, who's cooler than the bloody Batman, he thought. So, after buying several Batman comics, he flew back to Japan and showed his colleague Yoshinari Nishida the awesome superhero. This was the beginning of something awesome, as Nishida-san was one of the team members tasked with playing around with this new Mode 7 feature that we spoke about earlier. And as soon as Shimizu-san saw what was being done on the screen alongside his coolest Batman comics, he thought, this is it. I thought if we used that Batman and Mode 7 to make a racing game, it would shock everyone. As you may have guessed, going from this to this, well, it didn't happen instantly. Originally the cars had big fat wheels and looked more like Hot Wheel cars rather than futuristic hovercrafts. Why did this change? Well, to put it simply, the crazy amounts of different sprites needed to simply turn one of these vehicles was staggeringly high. And the pixel artist responsible for this, one Takeya Imamura, realised that if you simply take the spinning wheels off, well, that's a lot of time saved, and quite simply put, that was that. We decided to lose the tyres and have the racers hover. On top of this, it turned out that trying to render 3D buildings for the racers to drive through on top of the shifted Mode 7 background proved almost impossible. So, they came up with the idea to simply remove those too. And, I don't know, let's say it's a floating track above a city. In the future, right? Yeah, that all fits the setting. As you may have guessed, the whole thing came together quite organically from this point moving forward. And the setting of F-Zero was simply a result of the new exciting Mode 7 technology and the limitations of the system itself. Setting the game in the future, adding some super fast speed, some incredible jumps, it all just fit. Nintendo of America wanted something cooler than a top-down Formula 1 game with Mario on the front cover, but I don't think anyone expected a Batman-inspired futuristic hovercraft racer, right? Thanks, Tim. Can you imagine if America said yes to Fukpa 1R instead? Well, thankfully, they didn't. Everything was just joining together smoothly, so much so that Shigeru Miyamoto, who often outsourced quite a bit of Nintendo's work to third-party companies, felt that this newfangled Mode 7 game was best kept entirely in-house. It took, surprisingly, 7 people and Shigsy's input 15 months to create this new style of gameplay and fantastic new world, and thankfully, it was finished just in time for the Super Famicom's launch in Japan alongside Pilot Wings. Did it do well? Of course it bloody did! So, before we get into this guy's origins, which is probably one of the most bizarre pieces of this entire complete history, let's take a look at the game itself. F-Zero released all the way back in November 21st, 1990 in Japan, August the following year in North America, and during 1992 in PAL regions. It had a lot to live up to, and it nailed it. The futuristic high-coloured super fast speed looks great. It has an amazing soundtrack which also showed off what the new system was capable of, and best of all for me, it's go go go. Yep, choose your driver, choose your league, and boom, 400 kilometers an hour, apparently, whilst you listen to some high quality pumping beats. If you want story, then you're out of luck. That is unless you get the original box, where Nintendo wasted no expense in blowing up the world of F-Zero for those that actually wanted to go a little further looking it all up. Which is why I like this approach. I can't get enough when the story is told to you in a beautiful comic strip setup. Don't bother downloading this one for the Virtual Console, guys. You gotta buy the original. What else is there to say about this first release that can't be picked up by simply looking at it? Nothing really. If this looks like a fun game, that's because it is. If it looks like a hard game at some points, that's because it is. This is a game that showed the world what the new kid on the block was capable of, and other than the fact that it isn't exactly overfilling with content, probably the only negative I have to say about the game in all honesty, it's a game, like I said, that holds up rather brilliantly. If you've got a SNES, then get this game. It's an absolute must-own, and if you ask me, when I see Captain Falcon, I am always reminded of the brilliant Super Nintendo. Even more than this unshaven mess. But why is that exactly? After all, you don't see him in the game, do you? Is it simply because F-Zero was a launch title? Well, yes, that does indeed play a role in this thought process, but it's this guy's origins that really does connect him with the 16-bit wonder. You see, when this game was in its final stages of completion, Inamura-san was creating several illustrations for the game when all of a sudden, someone expressed the desire to make a mascot for the Super NES with a name like Captain something. So I started thinking about a character that would suit the colours of the Super Famicom controller, with some red and blue and yellow. This new character for the Super Nintendo and the final stages of F-Zero's illustrations all came together at the same time. It was only when the fruits of their labour was shown to Nintendo of America, who absolutely loved it all by the way, that they decided to change the Super Nintendo mascot into the F-Zero mascot, even if he was only ever seen on the box art and in the manual. There you go, Nintendo fans. You almost had a cigar-smoking, long-chinned 1930s pilot look-alike as the mascot for one of the most well-loved gaming systems of all time. How's that?
Nothing prepares you for F-Zero, created for the new Super Nintendo Entertainment System. You won't believe the power. You won't believe the control. You won't believe the jumps, the curves, or the feeling you get until you experience it for yourself.
Wow, that's fast.
F-Zero for the ultimate G-Force, only on the next generation from Nintendo. Now you're racing with power, superpower.
So, with fans loving F-Zero, critics loving F-Zero, and even rival console owners loving it too, although I doubt they would ever say that, obviously, a sequel was a no-brainer, and sadly, the Super Nintendo never got one. Well, I suppose if you lived in Japan and had the Satellaview, then I suppose you could say you actually got two sequels. Confused? Well, like I said, if you happen to live in Japan and happen to own a Satellaview and happen to download the what is essentially DLC BS F-Zero Grand Prix games during the short couple of hour time slots, then you can get pretty much the same game, plus an extra difficulty mode and a few extra tracks and different ships. Some of its game's content has been lost due to nobody having the data left over on the downloadable cartridge. However, some of it is still available, and because of this must-have, it's become a bit of a favourite among the bootleg selling market. The real important thing to note here is that F-Zero never stopped being an innovative tool used by the big end to show off whatever hardware or new idea they was working on at the time. The 16-bit generation was blown away by this, and the hungry Japanese market was, well, I assume, blown away by this too. And as you can imagine, it wasn't long before we got entry number 3.
F0X. 700 km/h. 1000 km/h. F0X, jeu ultra rapide. 1500 km/h. F0X sur Nintendo 64, vous n'en reviendrez pas.
It was during the development of Mario Kart 64 in 1996 when Shigsy decided that the time and the technology was right for another entry. So he got several programmers who recently worked on the beloved Wave Race 64 game and began development on F-Zero 64, which will obviously change its name eventually to F-Zero X, the first ever 60 frames a second racing game with 30 simultaneous players. Quite the accomplishment, right? Well, to get the system to actually do this, they had no choice but to make the game look as basic as possible. It's not bad looking, it's just incredibly minimalistic looking. The ships are simple shapes and the environments that you race in have almost no textures. It features all that early 3G gen stuff like fog to cover up draw distances and super wide tracks so you don't get to see much of the backgrounds. However, graphics aside, the game gets everything else spot on. The music is pumping, the tracks are insane, featuring all new corkscrews and loops, truly bringing the franchise into the next generation, and it won't take long before you completely forget about those bland graphics, because when a game runs as smoothly and as hectically as this one does, it's gonna be the last thing on your mind. Nintendo, yet again, nailed this release in my eyes. And sure, it was a bit of a risky move to remove something that was pretty much a key selling feature of the N64, but by doing so, they had a product that could show off how much nail-biting on the edge of your seat action could be had with this machine.
秒間60フレーム時速1500キロ音より速い奴らがやってきた世界最速レースゲーム NINTENDO'N64 F0X.
Oh yes, Japan always does these adverts better, don't they? So, F-Zero X, a worthy sequel, yes. A worthy purchase, hell yes. And considering it's an N64 game, it's actually not all that expensive either on the second-hand market, which sadly can't be said for its sequel. Remember that's the television's slight upgrade on the first game? Well, Nintendo decided to use the F-Zero license again to show off this thing. The Nintendo 64 DD, an expansion kit for the F-Zero X called the F-Zero X expansion kit, obviously, which was released for the system but only in Japan. It's got a couple of extra tracks, you got a ship editor, and easily best of all, you got the track editor. These are rather impressive editors by all accounts, and are fairly close to what the programmers themselves used when making the original game. But like I said, it was Japan exclusive, and is now not only the best game for the 64 DD, but also one of the most expensive due to the system being one of Nintendo's biggest flops, right up there with the Virtual Boy, which by the way, also had an F-Zero game for it. Although I would wager that a copy of that one would be worth a hell of a lot more, due to it never being released with only a few images to go on, which basically meant that F-Zero Maximum Velocity became the first game in the series to be released on a handheld system. And what an awesome looking game for such a brilliant system it was. Yet again, Nintendo had released a game that just wouldn't have been possible before on handheld. F-Zero Maximum Velocity is the sequel that classic SNES players wanted to get all those years ago, completely bringing back the style of the classic games with plenty more tracks and vehicles to choose from, made this an absolute must for fans of the original. However, if you was like me and you didn't own the SNES, oh, sorry, there I go again, and this was the first time you ever owned an F-Zero game, well then, you might struggle a little bit. Maximum Velocity is created for people that have already played the original. It might as well be called F-Zero Extreme Hard Mode. It just felt unfairly hard for a newcomer like myself that weren't willing to put a stupid amount of time into it. But let's be honest, that's the case with every addictive racer out there, right? I'm not alone in thinking this, am I? You got fun racing games that straight out of the gate are fun to play, and then you got games that you really need to learn before you get the maximum enjoyment out of them. And Maximum Velocity is one of those games. Every single F-Zero requires a slight learning curve to master, but this is slightly steeper. Don't be put off, it's not a bad game, it is a great game, but be aware it is a game that you are probably going to want to purchase after playing the original.
Game Boy Advance.
ロケットスタート。ブラストターン。インがいた。いけ。ジャンプ。よし。はえ。カートリッジ一つで4人で遊べる。マシンと一つになる快感。テクニックを磨いて 0.01 秒を争え。ゲームボーイアドバンス F-Zero。
Game Boy Advance, console quality gaming anywhere.
On Monday, the 18th of February, Nintendo of Japan made a very special announcement, and that was the release of the Triforce. No, not that Triforce, this Triforce. What the hell is this? Well, it's a brand new arcade board based on GameCube hardware. Nervous? Well, I can understand why. I've spoken many a times in the past about Nintendo's dodgy arcade days. Well, no need to fear here, because the name Triforce actually implies that Nintendo wasn't going to be the only company working on this unique hardware, because they brought Namco and SEGA along for the ride too. Can you imagine that? Hardware that has 3 awesome developers working on it at the same time? Huh. Well, imagine no more, because the very Nintendo named hardware did in fact exist. The aim of the Triforce was threefold: to expand the video game market, create a less expensive development environment for the high-cost arcade sector, and offer new ways to play video games linking the arcade and the home market. Speculation quickly spread across the internet about what game would be announced, with Soul Calibur 2 being at the top of the list. And then, just 4 days later at the AOU Expo in Japan on Friday the 22nd of February 2002, it was announced that F-Zero AX, a brand new F-Zero arcade game created by Sega's very own Amusement Vision, most well known for Super Monkey Ball, was in development. A strange idea, right? Well, no, it wasn't. Sega were arguably the king of the arcades, creating the most popular arcade racers ever made, which is why it was actually the perfect fit. But get this, F-Zero AX wasn't the only game that they was releasing, because my favourite game in the series was also put out on the GameCube called F-Zero GX. And if you happen to take a memory card with a save slot from this game and put it into this arcade game, then you can even unlock extra tracks for you to play at home. Gah, remember when arcades used to be this cool?
Customize your own machine and race through 20 gravity-defying courses at ridiculous speeds. F-Zero GX. The future of racing is in your hands. Only for Nintendo GameCube. Rated T for Teen. GameCube.
So, F-Zero GX. Why do I love it so? Other than the obvious. Well, firstly, it looks stunning, keeping up that brilliant 60 frames a second that the game before it managed to keep a hold of, as well as completely expanding the look of the game whilst playing too. An F-Zero game has never looked this stunning, and they're going to have a hard job topping this one with any future entries. That is if they ever decide to make a new one. But on top of the look and design, the gameplay is also a perfect blend between the crazy track types found in X, merged with the tight twists and turns that you need to master from the original. It doesn't take long to get used to the game, but just like all classic arcade races, you are going to want to put some serious time into working out every single track layout if you want to beat your best times. Oh, and can we give a quick shout out to the soundtrack too? Oh my god, it's so good, and it's exactly what you would expect. Hard EDM over here and hard rock over there. Mwah, mwah, mwah. Perfection. You got 30 vehicles with plenty of customizations, you can buy upgrades and strangely extra chapters in the very cheesy storyline. Basically, there is something for everyone in this game, but especially for those hardcore fans of futuristic racers. In a nutshell, it's the perfect way to go out for F-Zero. But would you believe it? 2 more games were released, both based on the F-Zero anime. Now, guys, whilst we look at F-Zero GP Legend and the Japan exclusive F-Zero Climax, both of which were released on the Game Boy Advance, let me ask you this. Are you getting bored of this yet? No, not my video. The game series. No? Well, that's good for you. Go and pick these games up. GP Legend is pretty much the ultimate version of the classic game, filled to the brim with story modes, time attacks, plenty of ships, all that good stuff, whilst the later release Climax, which is perfectly fine for any fan of the series, is really just more of the same, although it does lack a little bit in the extra content. Now guys, please, I'm not saying that these games are bad. Again, they're both absolutely fine. After all, I like the classics, and it's a formula that they nailed from the get-go 14 years before these ones came out. But come on, how many more times can they repackage these games? And that is really the reason I decided to do this complete history, with this brilliant 3D racer which perfectly improves on the already great N64 original, and probably more Mode 7 style games that you're ever going to want to play. Where else is there for this series to go? When Shigsy was told that plenty of fans want to see a new entry in the series, he replied with the same thing. What else is there to do with F-Zero? It's a tough one, because even as I lay this big steaming dump of truth onto a franchise that has literally never had a bad game in it, quite the accomplishment I might add, there is nothing else that needs to be done with this franchise, besides making an HD remake of that GameCube game in my eyes. But hey, I may be wrong. Like I said, the series was perfect from day one, and Nintendo and SEGA have evolved it further than my wildest dreams. It's a series that almost outstayed its welcome. But thankfully, it did what all good shows, movies, comics, books, and in this case game franchises have done before it. It left us wanting more, and the more Nintendo tease us with Mario Kart DLC, Smash Brother characters, Nintendo Land minigames, mangas, and whatever else, they keep building up the fanboy fire. So, until we reach a time where console developers create something radically different from 2D games, 3D games, and arcade games, all of which this franchise has perfected, I say, let's leave F-Zero be. We have got plenty to keep us going. Well, other than a nice HD port, that is. With online play. Okay, I'm done. Hey there guys, thanks for checking out the 50th complete history video. Wow, can you believe it? Oh yes, and what an awesome franchise to have as my 50th complete history. So, as usual, this is the part of the video where I give a big special shout out to all of my Patreons, but an extra big special shout out goes to Ryan Burford, Gary Pinkett, Andrew Dalton, Brent Craft, Joe Lazarez, Ian A. Chapman, Phil Lowlins, Aaron McNamara, Ian Roberts, Video Game Basement, Hananaz, Retro to Next Gen, Garzagor Cielski, Samuel Victor, Red the Beard, John Fuller, Michael Conrad, Constantine, Pretendo 64, Mike Fallon, Gavin Gorvez, Creamy Elephant, James Loveridge, Casey Garner, Blitz, Hedgie Ben Hall, Gemma and Mr. T-Shirts, Jacob Coy, Marcus King Emo Cut, June, Rob Jenkins, The Geeky Dad, Richard Carter, aka Fantastic Dizzy, Dunder Control, Todd Paul Float G, Petty Mew, and Brian Rawson. If you wanted to get your name shouted out, get your name shown, come and see what I'm working on, join the exclusive rooms in the Discord chat, and plenty of other random exclusive stuff that I give to all of these lovely peeps, then please be sure to click the link that you see on the screen. Don't forget to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, a thumbs down, whatever you prefer. But for now, this is DJ Slope signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time.